Welcome to part 7 of The Little-Known Drivers of Easter, a series of reflections for Lent. I'm John Bridges, the author of Blood of Innocents. I'm a Christian minister, and I've spent several years studying the history of the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth. Between now and Easter Sunday, I'm reading a series of short pieces of historical fiction, extracts from the Blood of Innocents. They're the sort of conversations and observations that were happening among the people who saw Jesus in Jerusalem, and of course had no idea how the story would end. I hope it will help us to rediscover why we still do Easter 2,000 years later. In the last episode, we looked at how Caiaphas the high priest and his lawyer might have plotted to get Jesus convicted by the Romans of the capital crime of sedition. Having arrested Jesus on the last night before the Passover festival, they interrogate Jesus in the high priest's palace, seeking evidence to take to Pontius Pilate the next day. It suddenly struck Caiaphas that they had reached the darkest of the hours before dawn. And if the night was dark, he mused, it was little darker than his feelings about the increasingly fruitless interrogation that they were presently conducting. He normally considered it a failure to be out of his bed much past midnight, and this whole night was heading into that failure category. The accusations being levelled against Jesus were groundless, and worse still, Jesus could see that. He was simply refusing to speak. As planned, Iscariot had led the temple guards to Jesus, and after a bit of a fracas, they had arrested him. Jesus had supposedly performed yet another miracle, healing Caiaphas' own slave Malchus, who had allegedly been struck on the head in the fight. Malchus had confirmed that he had had his right ear injured, and sensing evidence for a quick conviction for something like attempted murder, Caiaphas and Eleazar had formally questioned him. A reliable man, Malchus could have made a good witness. There was, however, little physical evidence and none against Jesus. While Caiaphas would normally have been delighted that his slave was healthy, another miraculous cure by Jesus was, in view of the aim of the arrest, less than helpful. As Eleazar had pointed out, even with a severed ear and a culprit to accuse, one would be hard put to get a conviction, given the fact of several armed men blundering about in an unlit olive grove on a dark night. The interrogation had not begun until after midnight. The trial in front of Pilate was now only an hour or so away, and so far there was nothing that would stand even a cursory investigation by the governor. Another Pharisee testified that Jesus had said he would destroy the temple in 3 days and then rebuild it. Caiaphas rubbed his eyes. This is going nowhere, he thought. Threats to demolish and rebuild one of the biggest buildings in the world might convince Pilate that Jesus was completely insane. It would not convince him that Jesus was a threat to the Roman Empire. Eleazar had been right. They would have to accuse Jesus of insulting the dignity of the emperor. Caiaphas knew Pilate wouldn't like that either, but if he tried to dismiss it, they could threaten to tell Tiberius that Pilate was letting a dangerous man go. The emperor wouldn't waste time investigating a miscarriage of justice against a labourer who wasn't even a Roman citizen. Tiberius might well act if Pilate was less than diligent about rooting out rebels. Caiaphas stifled a yawn as politely as he could. He still thought one death was less bad than a bloodbath on the streets. He looked at Jesus, who was sitting apparently impassive, having hardly spoken a word all night. We can sleep peacefully tomorrow, at least, he thought, if we know he's a blasphemer. That, though, reminded Caiaphas of a nagging doubt he'd had about Jesus all along. We've assumed that Messiah will lead us to free the Hebrew lands. Yet the Lord's ways are not always our ways, he reminded himself. We've assumed that Messiah might be like us. But what if God chose a complete outsider? Caiaphas couldn't conceive why that might be, but what if? His brain struggled even to engage with the question at this hour. If Jesus was Messiah and had properly forgiven sins, then didn't that make him God in the flesh? Emmanuel, God is with us? Then Caiaphas's brain raced at another sudden thought. That would mean this Jesus is either a charlatan, or worse, or he's everything he says he is. So are we about to kill Messiah? Caiaphas closed his eyes. If he's not Messiah, we can condemn him by our own laws, even if the legal case is questionable to the Romans. If we let him go free, after all, we endanger the nation, so the end will justify the means. Yet this man is doing nothing to avoid his own death. If he is Messiah, does God need him to die? If Jesus is Emmanuel, has God decided to die himself? Caiaphas knew that many godly Hebrews had been martyred in the past. If we don't kill him, will we be standing in God's way? Is letting Jesus die doing God's work, even if our part will be to sacrifice an innocent? So perhaps it is still better that one man should die for the sake of the nation. With a vague hope that the phrase wouldn't become his epitaph, Caiaphas made up his mind. Jesus has to die. That decision made, he realized that he had to finish this himself. He held his hand up, and the room went quiet. "How do you respond to the testimony that these men are bringing against you?" Caiaphas asked calmly. "Have you no answer?" Jesus' silence continued. "I put you under oath before the living God," demanded Caiaphas emphatically. "Tell us if you are the anointed one." "You say so," said Jesus, finally speaking for himself. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, and coming with the clouds of heaven." Caiaphas stood, and with some relief, ceremoniously tore part of his robe. "Why do we need any witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy." He signalled at Jonathan. "Captain, hold him while we discuss this case." At dawn, Jesus was taken to Pilate and eventually convicted and executed for sedition. His disciples deserted him, and that should have been the end of the story. Sunday's podcast, though, looks at the start of something never seen before. Until then, thank you for listening, and every blessing.